Hey guys, Dark Skeleton here, and like a bunch of you, I'm sure I've been playing some GVG Arena since the other day. 4 runs in total, 2 of which were Warlock, and in the latest run I was actually able to pull off 12 wins and 2 losses with a Warlock deck. And in these clips I'm going to be demonstrating a certain card that just came out, and that's the Floating Watcher. Now, I liked this card originally, but I didn't think I'd have as much success as I really did when I drafted this card. So Floating Watcher is a 5 mana cost demon with 4/4 stats, but while it's on the board, whenever you as the hero take damage, the Floating Watcher will gain a +2/+2 buff, and that does stack. So in a lot of ways it's like a shade of Naxxramas. Now in Warlock, the obvious trigger for this is to just life tap, which not only nets you an extra card, but also throws that +2/+2 buff onto the Floating Watcher. And you can do this over and over and over again. So Floating Watcher becomes a card that, if it's not removed immediately, actually becomes a huge threat, just like a Shade. So the question I'd like to propose is whether or not Floating Watcher is actually insane in Arena mode. The first Warlock run, I think I did draft 1 or 2 of them. I only managed to go 4 or 5 wins, the deck was overall less strong. But yeah, as I said, the second run, I go 12 wins against some very tough opponents who have tons of controlling cards. And it was actually an uphill struggle in many cases, in terms of card advantage. I had to fight for the board as Sue tends to. But of course, since you're a Warlock, as long as you can life tap, you're good. Everyone already knows that Shade of Naxxramas is a huge threat. You can't leave him around on the board. The fact he comes out with stealth is great because you're allowed to basically stall until you have the optimal trade you want to make. The downside of Floating Watcher is A, it doesn't have that, and B, it does only come out with 4/4 stats, which isn't too unlike Shade of Naxxramas for 3 mana to 2 stats. But I will say that the Floating Watcher does require some setup. You definitely want to have board control, or else your opponent is likely to just take it out. Now, one excellent way of getting out the Floating Watcher, like other demons, is to just use a Void Caller. Of course, you can't reliably draft those in Arena. I managed to get 1, luckily. I would have taken 10 if I could. Well, maybe not 10, maybe 3 or 4, but very, 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 very solid Arena card. I just love them to death, and that's usually how I win with Warlock, even before the GVG expansion. But regardless of how you get it out, if you're able to keep it around until it becomes a 6/6, possibly that means playing it directly from your hand on turn 7 and then immediately making it 6/6. Or if you have any other fancy way to trigger it like a Mad Bomber, that might work as well. Now the deck that I actually drafted was kind of a mid-rangey Sue Warlock. I was able to beat a lot of mages because I had a lot of 6 health guys. That includes the Floating Watcher once you buff it up, and Dread Infernals are good against Flamestrike as well. Every game was basically a struggle for board control. I would be aggressively making trades, even if I had to trade down just to keep everything off of the opponent's board. Now if we compare it to some of the top 5-drop minions that you can draft in Arena, such as the Sludge Belcher, then in that case you're getting 4/7 stats for 5 mana, whereas Floating Watcher is 4/4. Of course you can always buff it up, but the problem is you have to pay extra mana almost in all circumstances in order to buff it up. One thing I did notice is that if you're able to have something like a Flood Imp on the field, and you're able to keep buffing up the Floating Watcher's HP or restoring it with an Earthen Ring Farseer, then you can have it stick on the board pretty well in Arena mode. I've been noticing there's actually a surprising lack of polymorphs and hexes, and that kind of stuff being actually drafted in Arena, so big creatures are really, really imposing on a lot of other players. There was actually only like 1 Shaman the entire run that had more than 1 hex. But the problem he ran into is not only did I have the Floating Watchers, but I also had Dread Infernals, Boulderfist Ogre, and a couple other big cards that other players just couldn't really deal with in the late game. Now given that it has a +2/+2 buff, it might be worth comparing to another card such as the Ethereal Arcanist, which is a 3/3, I believe for 4 mana, that also gets +2/+2, but for every turn that you have a secret on the field. The problem with that in Arena is that getting secrets out is actually pretty inconsistent because you're not going to draft too many of them 9 out of 10 times. The thing about Floating Watcher is that in all circumstances where you're really far ahead, you can keep life tapping over and over again. And that's just going to buff the Floating Watcher up more. Now given that I was far enough ahead that I was able to keep buffing up my Floating Watchers and causing them to be a huge problem for my opponents at basically every single game, you could say that, yeah, it's really, really, really good when you're already ahead, so it's kind of like a win more card. But if you're behind, then what's going to happen? What if it's the last card in your hand, and it's turn 7 or 8? Well, then at least it's still a 6/6, but if it's turn 5, that's probably not the card you want to be the last one in your hand. But even in its absolute worst case, it's still a 4/4, which is not that easy to remove for a lot of classes, especially ones like Priest. Now the dream scenario would be if you could get enough Void Callers to bring them out for free, because if you can get them out for free, then you're guaranteed to be able to live tap on the following turn, and use the new 6/6 you just attained to really dominate your opponent. Now one of the things I really wonder about this card is it only really strong in games where you already have a really strong arena deck that has massive amounts of board control? Or would it be equally good in any arena draft where you're able to take it? So I've got to ask, since it's already so new into the GVG expansion, have any of you had experiences with Floating Watcher? Have you found it to be a very hard card to play against, a very strong card to play, or have you actually found it easier to beat players that like to run this card? Feel free to leave a comment down below. I've been Dark Skeleton, and thank you all for watching.